A new report out today suggests the government has too many ministers. To talk about that, I'm joined by New Zealand Initiative Research Fellow, Max Salmon. So, we have far more ministers than other similar countries?
Yeah, that's the long and short of it, essentially. If you take similar countries, similar populations, parliamentary democracies, we are about triple the number of ministerial portfolios, more than double the number of departments, and about half again as many ministers.
So what's bad about that? I mean, on the surface, it might mean that these areas get better treatment, more specialist, more attention.
I do think that was the motivating reason that we've ended up with the system we have. However, the real problem is the complexity. So if you imagine a four-tiered, 4 rows, and across the rows, lots of lines connecting them. You've got policy sectors here, then the departments in charge of them, and then next to them you have the ministerial portfolios, and across those you have the ministers themselves. In between all of these, it's a massive interconnected mess. It's incredibly convoluted. MB, the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment, answers to no less than 16 ministers. There are policy sectors like environment are split across 5 or so different departments and agencies. It has become needlessly complex, I think in part because no one really thinks of looking at what's right in front of their nose and saying, is this how we should be doing it?
Does it relate, because there's been a lot of questions too around funding and around the way appropriations go to separate departments, and yet there will be, when you're talking about across departments, sort of, say in the environment, an environmental spend that will be split among all those departments, and the Auditor General keeps on saying we don't know how effective that sort of spending is. Does that reflect the sort of concerns you have about multiple sort of ministers? And
I think it does. It's a second order effect that happens on the periphery because of how the system is set up itself. If you think about, like you say, like the environment appropriation, that's a select amount of money that's available, and then you have these 5 or more departments and agencies and independent bodies that are funded by the Crown that are then all trying to get a piece of this pie and all very validly believe that their work is incredibly important and could use a bit more funding. And so it becomes a constant fight to try and enlarge that pie, and that's made more and more competitive by how many departments there are.
So what do? Do we get rid of these departments, get rid of what?
I think the answer, as it strikes me, is to streamline. So if you look at, I talked about the other comparative countries before. I think a really good example is Norway. So Norway, very similar population, very similar constitutional system. And the main difference with them is that they have an incredibly streamlined setup. So you have the policy sector, which is the environment, and then for that you have a single ministry for the environment that covers all things to do with the environment, and then you have a single portfolio, the environmental minister, and then you have a single minister that holds that portfolio. And so it's not even necessarily, there's a lot of talk at the moment about public sector cuts and so on. It's completely agnostic of the size of the public service itself, and it's about the structural organisation. And I think the answer is to go back to look overseas and see how things are done and ask ourselves, all right, could we be doing as well as they are?
I mean, the previous national-led government tried to do that, I suppose, in a way with MB when it brought together a whole lot of agencies, departments it thought had kind of similar outcomes around the economy and what have you, or interests, and yet we've ended up, 16 ministers who...
Yes, and I think that's part of the problem, I think, there may be one CE of MB, but there's no one minister of MB. I think the other issue is that the portfolios within MB aren't as interrelated as perhaps envisioned at the time of its creation. And I think, and subsequently it is too ranging and too large, and perhaps a good example of what we shouldn't do if we stop to consider what potential reforms might look like.
So in terms of your research note, you'd put a limit of 20 ministers total in the executive?
Yes, I can't see a reason for much beyond that. I'd be open to something akin to the UK's junior minister system, where currently, although we have associate ministers, every associate minister is in fact a full minister that holds additional associate portfolios. I'd be open to having outside of cabinet several associate ministers, if need be, for portfolios that are understandably quite large and complex.
And you've also raised the suggestion, though, that a few ministers could be appointed from outside of Parliament, which would be obviously a big step.
Yes, yeah, big step for us, but I think it's important that we start the conversation. I think that at the moment we're very limited by the fact that ministers must come from within Parliament. So I think about 44% of the current ministers, the current MPs that make a government, 44% of them are also serving as members of the executive, which I think has a variety of downflow effects that I don't talk about in the report because they're more related to democratic reform. However, I think that we need to recognise that with such a small selection size for ministers, we are unnecessarily tying our hands in terms of the expertise that could be brought to government.
Do you have a particular view on which portfolio areas we need that expertise, or would it just be dependent on the
No, I think that'd be at the Prime Minister's discretion. And I would limit this. I'm not saying we should adopt a model like the US is, where every single cabinet minister is an external appointee with some Senate oversight. I think that this would be a limited number of ministers to essentially allow for what happens very riskily under the list system currently, where list appointees are normally these more technocratic expert officials. However, when you have an electoral sweep, like as has happened at the last 2 elections, and suddenly the number of list MPs entering Parliament is low, that really throws a spanner in those works. So it'd be more about reassuring New Zealand and reassuring the government that they were going to have the expertise necessary to run the country effectively.
Max Salmon, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, Brent.
For more content just like this and all the latest business and political news, head over to mbr.co.nz.